BBC Radio York.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about another night of drama at Westminster. Theresa May has survived a vote of no confidence, but how further forward are we? Are we in a stalemate? It's 2.5 years of negotiations. Britain due to leave the EU in just 10 weeks. I can't reiterate this enough. It's just over 2 months. But how clear, or how much more clearer, are things? With me is Professor Charlotte O'Brien, who teaches EU law at York Law School at the University of York. She joins me this morning. Morning, Charlotte.
Good morning.
So look, how is your crystal ball gazing going?
Well, it's quite a foggy crystal ball, to be fair. Interesting times. I suppose the thing that a lot of people are talking about now is because of that 10-week deadline that we're looking at that's looming large, and the fact that we've reached a point where it feels like we're back at the starting point, really, that people are talking about having an extension, asking for an extension for Article 50 to get a little bit more time to have some sort of alternative arrangement in place to avoid this crashing cliff edge Brexit that we were warned about from the start that we'd be trying to avoid.
So you reckon not a lot of progress made? We're back to the beginning.
It does feel a little bit square one. That there's a lot of time been spent on withdrawal agreement that did not garner the support of Parliament, quite monumentally did not garner the support of Parliament. And so the idea of attempting to tweak that agreement just doesn't seem very realistic. First of all, the EU has made it clear that there's not much room to move on some of the things that have been described as problematic, like the Irish backstop and so forth. And secondly, it seems unlikely that Theresa May is going to win back more than 200 votes just on the basis of a few tweaks. And so I think that's where the idea of reaching out for cross-party support is coming from, is to sort of almost go back to the drawing board and see, can we draw up some new agreement that will have support from the off?
The trouble is, though, in terms of the EU, we've already heard that there is going to be no renegotiation. So how does what is the response going to be from the EU?
Yeah. Well, there have been noises suggesting a little bit more flexibility on the point of extension that had been previously suggested. So we'd been told, there would only be, or it had been suggested, there'd only be an extension if there was another referendum or a general election. And now there've been suggestions from Germany, from France, and from Michel Barnier as well, that there may be an extension possible for the purposes of getting parliamentary support round some sort of option, some sort of agreement. I think reopening negotiations on the existing agreement is unlikely, but what they think is if there's something perhaps... I think the phrase that was used by Michel Barnier was something more ambitious was proposed, that there would potentially be room to manoeuvre on that.
Legally, could Britain actually leave the EU? Or, stay in the EU? That's the other thing, to actually stay in the EU.
That's a really good question. Legally,
hooray!
Legally, yes. From an EU law point of view, we had at the end of last year, the Court of Justice came back with the Whiteman case, finding that the UK could unilaterally revoke Article 50 if it wanted. It didn't need permission from the other member states. However, it can't do that in bad faith. It can't do it just to buy more time. It would have to be with an intention of actually staying. And from a UK law point of view, well, it's been said repeatedly, the referendum is advisory, that Parliament is not necessarily bound by it, but the prospect of Parliament simply overturning a referendum, it would be unlikely to be seen as very legitimate.
Well, I can imagine a lot of people would be really, really upset about that. The vote was made and this is where we are.
Exactly.
Would a hard Brexit have implications on Europe too? Because nobody wants it, but what kind of implications would it have?
Well, I suppose the first point to make is that the withdrawal agreement that was proposed was, in fact, stepping stones towards a hard Brexit. That without an agreement, what we're facing is just a quick hard Brexit, that there will be no transition period. In terms of having no transition period and no sort of stepping stones, yes, it will have an impact upon the EU. They'd want to avoid it, not least because of the desire to avoid a hard border in Ireland. that if Northern Ireland is suddenly on WTO terms, that creates very significant problems. However, the idea that the EU should be more concerned about Ireland than the UK, I think, is perplexing. I think that's a concern for everyone around the table.
Charlotte, thank you ever so much for coming in the studio this morning. I know it's early, but I really appreciate your time.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Professor Charlotte O'Brien, she teaches EU law at the York School of Law at the University of York. You're listening to Georgie at Breakfast.